Hi, I'm Dave, and this is Crawford, and welcome back to the Compliance Files. Crawford's decided he will be Mulder in this one, and I will be Scully. In this particular discussion, we're going to talk about the topic of expenses and what expenses contractors can still claim if they are working on an engagement via an umbrella company. So, Crawford, what can they claim?
Okay, so the first question is, are they under supervision, direction and control? Now, what you will find is the vast majority of umbrella companies, and in light of the off-payroll, will automatically assume that workers are under supervision, direction and control.
Oh, we're not going to talk for an hour what supervision, direction and control means, right?
No.
Okay, good.
So they'll assume that they're under supervision, direction and control. And what that means is that it limits the contractors to what they can claim on their expenses. So if you look at a typical full-time employee, when they travel to their workplace, they can't claim expenses because it's classed as a permanent place of work.
Yeah, when they're going from home to the place of work.
Absolutely right. Well, that's exactly the same for a contractor. So if a contractor has a single site that they're visiting, that under the legislation is deemed as their permanent place of work, and therefore there are no expenses.
Is their permanent place of work even just at the start of the contract? There's none of this 24-month rule stuff that we all used to know and love.
No, because within the legislation for supervision, direction and control, it basically says that each engagement is treated as a separate position for employment purposes. So what happens is it becomes a series of permanent workplaces. So, for example, if a nurse is in hospital 1 on day 1, hospital 2 on day 2, hospital 3 on day 3, that's 3 permanent workplaces. So the 24-month rule and all those are overridden, really, in most cases by that legislation, how it reviews it.
So it's considered permanent workplace. So what can they claim for expenses they incur when they're at the workplace?
No, same as an employee. So employees can't claim those.
What can
expenses.
they claim then?
When they can claim an expense is where they're classed generally as a multi-site worker. So typically you will see workers who may go from one client house to another client house to another client house, or visit 3 or 4 or 5 sites in a day. Where they're visiting those sites, there could be expenses that are claimable.
Which is mileage?
Well, mileage is the common one. And the reason why mileage is there was another piece of legislation put in which changed all the rules for employer expenses. And within that, there was a test. And that test was called relevant salary sacrifice. And it basically said where you lower your general earnings by the amount you're claiming expenses, you can't use the expenses as tax-free. An exemption to that was mileage. So what you'll find is where you are working at multiple sites and they can be seen as a temporary place of work, if you're driving, you may be able to claim the mileage allowances to those sites.
But that's not to say if you've got a contract with a driving company and you turn up at the place to do the driving work, you can then claim mileage for everything you've done. So in most cases, really, there's hardly any expenses a contractor can claim. Well, if they use it via an umbrella company.
Well, they can't claim it direct from the umbrella company. What they've all got is the option where if the expenses are allowable, what they have to do now is claim them through their self-assessment tax return.
It's not done through the umbrella company anymore?
No, mileage is the only thing that the umbrella is allowed to reimburse because it doesn't fail the relevant salary sacrifice test. Any other allowable expenses, the contractor is perfectly at will to claim through, in the same way an employee would claim on their self-assessment tax return for professional subscriptions or something like that. It wouldn't be the employer doing it. You'd claim those and demonstrate the revenue that they were allowed.
What about a piece of equipment if they bought a laptop or something like that? Could capital purchases, can they claim that? Or is we into... No.
You're into, because they're an employee, then it would have to be the employer buying it and providing it to them. And of course, umbrellas don't want loads of hundreds of computers,
tons of
and assets,
on there.
And suddenly you leave after 3 months and you've got to hand your laptop back.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense, does it?
There's no point in doing all of that. So that's expenses where they're being reimbursed out of your rate. So if you're on £200 a day and you've done an amount of mileage, then that £200 would be reduced and you'd have whatever the relevant expenses paid. But there's also what's called agency reimbursed or rechargeable expenses.
Agency recharged expenses.
Agency reimbursed or rechargeable.
Okay.
Now, those expenses are where within the contract that the umbrella has with the agency, it says, if we ask you to not come into your normal place of work and go to a different site and do something,
Right.
we'll reimburse you for the costs you incur. So what you've got is you've got the opportunity of agency reimbursed expenses
Agency
or
reimbursed
rechargeable
expenses.
expenses.
Okay.
And that's within the contract that the umbrella signs. It would say if the worker is going to site A and we require them to then go and visit site B for whatever
Right.
reason,
Yeah.
for a temporary purpose,
Yeah.
then we'll reimburse their
But
costs.
the agency said they're reimbursed.
Yeah, so the agency would then invoice the client,
Okay.
and the client would pay those additional monies. So it's a contractual test that says in these situations you can get the money. Now, what we had was a guy who was working in London. He had to go to a project meeting in Amsterdam.
Right.
So he organised his flights out the city airport on the Thursday night. The meeting was early Friday morning. He had to stay in a hotel, have his evening meal, his
Yeah.
breakfast. He did the meeting and he flew back.
So that would be just like you're a classic employee and you've had expenses for your travel and business travel.
Absolutely right.
But you're claiming it back off the agency in that instance.
Yeah, well, the umbrella claims it from the agency. So
Okay.
what they've now got is additional money. So you haven't
Okay,
got the
right.
general earnings test because they've got an additional amount of money that's outside of the contract.
Okay. Yep.
So because it's not tested against the relevant salary sacrifice, what the worker can do
Yeah.
is then put a claim in for themselves as an employee to the umbrella. Now, where the
Yep.
confusion sits is not normally it'll be the worker that makes the claim to the agency because they're the one that's incurred the expenses and attach it. But under the legal contractual terms, they're really doing that on behalf of the umbrella company.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
they've almost
yeah.
got to do a duplicate claim
Yeah.
into the umbrella on the basis of them being an employee and claiming these costs. And the requirement on the umbrella is to prove that it was to a temporary workplace and wholly necessary for business purposes.
This is a lot of faffing about, isn't it, to claim those expenses? Would it not be easier for that end client to just have their department buy the plane ticket and book the hotel for the contractor to do that?
Some end clients will organise things and have a way of doing it. The key part is if the money comes into the umbrella company,
Yeah.
as the employer, they have all these obligations. And
Okay.
another example would be we saw an agency where their agency reimbursed expenses was saying to the contractor, if you have to go anywhere else, we're just going to pay you an amount of £1 a mile.
Okay.
Now, there's nowhere in the tax legislation that you can reimburse at £1 a mile.
No, it's 45p a mile still, isn't it?
Absolutely right. But what they were saying was that's going to cover your mileage, that's going to cover any meals, that's
right,
going to cover
okay.
accommodation if you need to
Yeah,
stay.
I know.
And so what happened was the umbrella made the claim of, let's say, 100 miles to the agency. The agency
Yeah.
paid £100. When the worker, the employee contractor, submitted their claim to the umbrella,
Yeah.
they would put that they'd done 100 miles at 45p a mile, but they could also put on that they had a meal, that they had drinks.
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
And so they could put on all those other expenses, attach the receipts for them.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the umbrella was then able to reimburse all of the allowable expenses. Now, in some cases, if that came to £80, they'd reimburse £80 tax-free. £20 would be added to the PAYE. If the worker claimed £120, they could only reimburse up to the £100.
So I guess
that they
this
received.
is, I mean, that is a lot of faffing about, but you can see how some contractors might be doing those types of contracts where they are doing lots of travel and they need that mechanism. So going back to one of the previous discussions we had, there probably won't be umbrella companies that do all of this stuff because it's real vanilla.
You've got a range. Some
Stuff.
umbrellas do no expenses at all because typically
Yeah.
the marketplace they operate in, workers aren't getting
I
agency
mean, that is most of the
reimbursed.
market. Vast majority is
Yeah.
no expenses, right?
Yeah. And the expectation from workers now is very low on expenses. You've got a number of umbrella providers. If a contractor is expecting agency reimbursed or rechargeable expenses, they can often be significant amounts.
Yeah, yeah.
And so there are umbrellas that will work with those and be able to have a process where the worker can claim and they can assess it and pay any allowable ones tax-free. And then there are a few umbrellas. It's not a massive amount now because there's so few instances where it happens, that will also run mileage expenses as well as agency reimbursed. And what should happen is if you know you've got them, when you're having your initial discussions with an umbrella, just explain that they've got agency reimbursement and ask them to explain how they handle it. Ask them for their guide and their claim form. Because what contractors fail to realise is that when the claim is made to an agency, the agency is just making a test on what the contract word says. So it says, if you do this, we'll pay that. It doesn't say we will pay that tax-free. So they pay it. Once the umbrella gets it, it's the umbrella that's responsible for making the test against the tax legislation to make sure it's allowable.
Well, they have to make sure that, I guess, it's not taxed. Otherwise, they're going to end up out of pocket for spending that themselves. What then happens if a contractor, classic ones, working in far off sites, they travel down on a Monday, they stay 4 nights, and then they travel back on the Friday?
That was one of the big problems with the legislation.
What can they actually claim anything now if they're working through an umbrella company, or is that
generally not? Because what happens is you've got to look at the workplace. So those guys will typically be working at one work site, but they're very specialist. And when we wrote and responded to the consultation, we highlighted this problem because if you're building a nuclear reactor out in the middle of nowhere, you haven't got all the specialist work that you need in the local vicinity. So you have to bring people in. And the problem now is the guys that are coming in and they're driving in usually significant distances and having to stay through the week, because that's classed as a permanent place of work, there are no expenses that are allowable on it.
I mean, we touched on this in many of the presentations I've done on off-payroll and IR35. I've demonstrated that sometimes the contractor, if they're holding all the cards on the bargaining, holding all the cards and they've got all the bargaining power, their rates might have to increase by about 40% just for the client to end up paying them the same amount in their pocket after tax. So rates could skyrocket for some of these firms that are actually controlling those workers.
They tend to be higher paid workers. And what tends to happen is that they get into negotiations with those expenses where the worker understands that they're not going to be able to get tax relief on those expenses and they're going to lose those monies. Then what typically happens is there'll be compensation put through the rate. So we've seen rates where if you're working at the normal site A, you're on this rate. If we ask you to go to any other site, we'll increase the rate to this. So we're seeing the market already beginning to understand it and react to it to make sure that the contractors are getting to a point where they're comfortable with it.
Well, when they're just prepared to do the job, I guess, because otherwise if you're suddenly going from an outside IR35 position under a limited company to using an umbrella, and they're trying to...
Well, that's brought the focus on it. Because lots of the limited company contractors... and lots of the limited company contractors have been claiming those expenses. So where you've got the pressure with the umbrella is where you've got someone who was in a limited company claiming, accommodation, hotels, travel and all the rest.
It can be 25,000 a year in many cases we've seen.
And so suddenly they can't, and that has to be considered. And that will be one of the, the key questions in understanding when you're using an umbrella, if you're changing from your own limited company, is look at your ongoing expenses and understand what the umbrella is able to offer, what their process is. And a lot of the umbrellas, when they first talk to you, if you say, I've got all these expenses, they'll get into a detailed conversation with you because from their point of view, they want to be able to tell you whether they believe they're likely to be able to pay that tax-free or not. Because what they don't want is to sign you up and suddenly have a big fallout with you because you've got one expectation, they've got it. So responsible providers will understand and give you guidance on it. And if that's proving to be a problem, then we go back to the recruitment company and there's a negotiation gone in.
Okay, so that's a very useful discussion about expenses. I think we've covered absolutely everything. If we haven't, then please put some comments below the video, and we look forward to seeing you in the next Compliance Files.